So the name of my paper is Russia's Traditional National Aspirations and Narratives in Contemporary Policymaking. And let me begin by saying that indistinct and ambiguous national identity is Russia's ever-present problem. Throughout their 1,000-year-long history as a nation, Russians have been trying to figure out who they are, and to this day, they do not have a clear answer. 3 decades have passed since the dissolution of the USSR, yet the post-Soviet national character remains undetermined, acknowledged none other than Putin himself implicitly when he said, quote, "Finding and strengthening national identity really is fundamental for Russia." And the quote, finding is the key word here, of course. Are they European or are they Asian? Or Eurasian, perhaps, as some interesting characters such as political scientist Alexander Dugin and others have claimed, offering an eclectic and potentially explosive ideological mixture of primitive nationalism, Bolshevism, and Orthodox Christianity. And speaking of Christianity, must a true Russian also be Russian Orthodox? And if an ethnic Russian has foreign citizenship or lives abroad, does he count? What are the common values of the Russians, and what are their country's national goals and aspirations? Not infrequently, those who are invested with or claiming to have capabilities to define Russia and its national goals demonstrate muddled vision or outright confusion. Let's take, for example, Pushkin, the pillar of Russian culture and national pride. Writes historian Hubertus Jan, and I quote, "In his travel account of 1835, Pushkin highlighted 2 different notions of Russian national identity. On the one hand, he explicitly referred to the Caucasus and to the newly acquired territories as Russia. In other words, he depicted Russia as a multinational empire. On the other hand, he constantly described the Caucasus as foreign and exotic, and clearly as part of the so-called Orient, primitive, barbaric, and obviously very different from Russia, defined now as only the Slav heartland of the empire, an Orthodox nation inhabited by ethnic Russians." Since Pushkin's time, of course, cultural figures, ideologists, and state leaders have emphasized both perception of national identity, the imperial and the ethnocultural, often in a confusing way and simultaneously. Russian national effort to forge a clear identity has been a roller coaster. Traditional values have been upheld, then radically denied, redefined time and again, then suddenly readopted in their original form, soon enough to be altered. A key element of the national identity, the country's history, has been interpreted and reinterpreted again. The process of the creation, negation, and recreation of the country's fluid identity is a red thread that goes through the fabric of Russia's national life, and a key factor in understanding this policy of the state. Quote, "Russians are in a state of permanent identity crisis," claims Zinovy Zinnik, a Russian-born British writer. "People with a vague perception of themselves and of the socio-political space are bound to be confused, vacillating, insecure, and prone to negative self-identification. As such, they are more likely to derive their identity by contrasting themselves to quote unquote others. The West, for example, to convince themselves of how great they are in comparison." Quote, "Do not forget," urges an official propaganda film, "that the West seeks to, quote, dump Russia into the garbage bin of history. Typical is the harsh anti-Western messaging, such as Dmitry Medvedev's notorious warning that Russia was threatened and surrounded by the enemy on every side. The country's citizens then seek protection by a strong state and a national leader. Importantly, they are especially inclined to follow and or surrender to a leader who provides them with a collective frame of reference, common values, someone who promises to end the perpetual confusion by offering real identity and real meanings. And Putin, of course, does exactly that when he offers to the disoriented and traumatized Russians an identity. Not that he really united Russia in any meaningful way. It is still conflict-ridden and atomized, nor did he give his people any new system of beliefs or a vision to compensate for the crushing disappointment with the disintegration of the USSR, which Putin himself has proclaimed to be the greatest geographic catastrophe of the 20th century. Instead, Putin reformulated and popularized among his citizens one rather unsophisticated idea, namely, what unites everyone who lives on the Russian soil is that their state, or his or her state, is great. Putin, that's it. Putin did not invent the concept of Russian greatness, but readopted it as the essence of post-Soviet identity. Traditionally, the notion of Russia's greatness was based on a messianic goal of universal redemption. The concept originated soon after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. For the Russians, Byzantine's defeat was a divine punishment to the Greeks for straying from true orthodoxy. In 1492, Metropolitan Zosimus called Moscow, quote, the new city of Constantine, the original capital of Christianity. In the first quarter of the 16th century, Philotheus, a monk in the Pskov monastery, wrote a memorandum to Tsar Vasily III in which he developed this idea further. The first Rome and the second Rome, Constantinople, he claimed, had lapsed into heresy, ceased to be centers of Christianity, and must be replaced by Moscow. Because of the great sins, the two Romes have fallen, a third stands, and a fourth will not be. Until the day of final redemption, philosophers wrote, Moscow would be the spiritual center of the whole Christian world. This idea became known, of course, as Moscow, the Third Rome. Russia's role was to be properly messianic, with Moscow taking upon itself no less than the special responsibility for the salvation of all humanity. For centuries, this doctrine remained an integral part of the Russian national mythology and the fundamental principle of state ideology. It justified the imperial ambitions insofar as it legitimized the idea that it was Russia's destiny to be a light unto the nations and which had to lead the godless world to final salvation. Since the 16th century, Russians have persistently claimed that their history is, quote, suffused with sacred significance, being the culminating chapter of a sequence of historical events leading up to and including the apocalypse. The key here is that Russia's messianic role was taken for granted in any and all political regimes, be it a Tsarist regime, a Soviet regime, or post-Soviet regime. Scholars and thinkers underscored various parallels between this conception of Russia's special historical responsibility as the head of the true Christian church, and the Soviet Union's special historical responsibility as the guardian of the true, of one true Marxist-Leninist doctrine of communism, with its supposedly redemptive idea of classless society. Prominent Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev noted that Russia metamorphized from the Third Rome to the Third International, merely reformulating rather than abandoning its apocalyptic mission. In the post-communist reality, Putin sought to recreate the Russian national identity for the disoriented former Soviet citizens. Initially, he did not aim to sell his people a messianic project. Until early 2012, his propaganda only emphasized Russia's greatness. Anything great he could find or invent, including the Great Russian land, Great Russian literature, and of course the Great Russian soul. National greatness revealed itself, especially in his eyes, in the glorious statehood, Putin accentuated. The official line was that Russian citizens had always been part of the very same tradition, fused by the greatness of their state under the Tsars, under the Bolsheviks, and even under Stalin's Great Terror, which is pretty amazing that he actually said in an interview to journalists, when he was asked, how can you say that Russia was great? Think of Stalin's period. He said, sure, so what? Stalin was responsible for the Great Terror. Get it? Great Terror. Instead of repudiating its past, the nation must be proud that, like no other people, it has endured great sufferings, the sacrifice of the nation yielding great national achievements. For their part, the Russians have been willing to accept the absence of any new set of principles or values so long as they could be part of a great national whole. The alleged greatness of Russia did not cure the wound of not having a meaningful, time-proven and integrated identity, but it sufficed as a bandage. Millions of Putin's followers and supporters have been grateful indeed, as evident from his overwhelming support ratings. He had not solved Russia's economic problems, nor had he eradicated corruption. He has been steadily eliminating any chance for a stable democracy. But one thing Putin did do, he found a unifying label people have been craving since the early 1990s. Following the 2008 economic crisis and the 2011 public protest against election fraud, Putin realized that he could not sustain his regime's legitimacy or maintain mass support without a coherent, tradition-based messianic mission. He did not invent a new ideology, but simply reformulated and popularized the vital concept of Russia's greatness. That the Russian state was great now meant that it was to take the world along a visionary path towards a redemptive apocalyptic goal. Since 2012, Putin has insisted that Western societies have moved away from their roots and forsaken their Christian values, which has led to degradation and profound moral crisis. In contrast, he argued Russia had returned to the path of true faith. According to Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, this only intensified Western hostility because Russian Orthodox Christian goals were supposedly at odds with those of the apostates. Likewise, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov complained that the godless West coerced the Russians for being Christian traditionalists rather than for their international escapades, international relation policies, including their reckless ventures in the Ukraine. In the Russian political tradition, people are, to generalize, dispensable and disposable, essentially tools in the hands of the state. Overwhelmingly, people accept that no other treatment is warranted. But there's one condition on which they insist, that their sacrifices to the state be meaningful. By annexing the Crimea, Putin sent his citizens a clear message. Only a truly great country could get away with such boldness. More importantly, the Crimea is ours, Krim nash catchphrase has become a motto of official patriotism. Putin even framed the annexation as a case of ethnic irredentism, which is a policy of advocating the restoration to a country of any territory formerly belonging to it, aimed at reuniting the historical Russian land and its ethnic Russian population with the rest of the nation. Back in the 10th century, Prince Vladimir, the founder of the Russian statehood, was baptized in the Crimea. In line with his new appeal towards religion, Putin claimed that the Crimea was as sacred for the Russian people as the Temple Mount is for the Muslims and the Jews. And independent polling agencies showed that Russians, proud of the newly acquired messianic cause, have never been more supportive of Putin, whose approval rating in October 2014 was 88%. Then in September 2015, Putin ordered Russian warplanes into Syria to begin regular aerial bombardments to protect the embattled regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from what Moscow defined as jihadi terror. Traditionally, scholars have explained Russian aggressive Middle Eastern policy initiative by the country's wish to access warm water ports. That's a standard argument. While important, and no doubt that it is important, access to the Syrian port territories is certainly not critical because the Crimean Sevastopol does not freeze in winter. Thus, Russia's urgent need to access to the Mediterranean, the need bordering on obsession, really, may not explain or validate the new Russian adventure by geopolitical strategic factors alone. On the other hand, in connection with patterns of Russian historical development, it may reveal more profound and essential, if unappreciated, aspects of Russian political culture. These aspects, in fact, have become an integral part of the national identity, guiding its leaders and determining policy. Putin was clearly counting on the fact that over the centuries, the Russian people had absorbed the idea that foreign invention was ideologically, i.e. religiously justified. To be a good, quote unquote, good leader in the eyes of the people meant to be a messianic leader who pursued messianic foreign policy goals by becoming involved in ventures with potential to lead to an apocalypse-like development. The Syrian conflict undoubtedly contained this potential. It was an opportunity a traditional Russian leader had to seize, given Russia's visionary mission and his obligation to lead history towards its apotheosis. Viewed in those terms, the Middle East is a special attraction. And 66% of respondents in the national survey supported Putin's decision to intervene in Syria. About a month later, after the beginning of the intervention, Putin's approval rating reached an all-time high of nearly 90%, largely thanks to his military moves in Syria, according to a new independent nationwide poll. Oppressed politically and economically, Russians supported Putin's Middle Eastern adventures because they imparted a message that Putin's guiding principles in Syria were in line with Russia's traditional messianic aspirations as they had been outlined by the doctrine of Moscow, the Third Rome. Quote, Russia is constantly getting deeper and deeper into the past. It's a perpetual mixing of the past and of the present. Reconstruction of the past leads to military action. We are witnessing extraordinary political decisions being made by people acting in the present, but mistaking it for the past. And the quote says cultural historian Professor Alexander Etkin. His colleague, Simon Franklin, quotes a popular view in Russian scholarship. Let me quote this again. In the 4th to the 2nd millennium BC, the written culture of ancient Slavs gave rise to the following civilizations: Sumerian, Babylonian, Proto-Indian, Cretan, Ancient Greek, Ancient Roman, and eventually European. This kind of grandiose claim is a fairly typical product of the post-Soviet boom in state-supported history. The shelves budged with even more ambitious assertions. Ambitious indeed, that the ancient Etruscans were ancestors of the Russians, that Jerusalem was a Russian city, and obviously, as we all can imagine, Jesus was, of course, obviously, a Russian prophet. History thus strengthens the sacred aspirations that guide Moscow's policies in faraway lands. As a never popular stage star, Zhana Bichevskaya sang in a hit performance in May 2014. And let me quote as a summary the end of her song. "We will recapture Russian Sevastopol. This Crimean Peninsula will be Russian again, as well as our sovereign Bosphorus, our Constantinople, and Jerusalem, the shrine of humanity." End of quote. I think my time is up. Is it up, Golda? Or
it's still okay.
It's still okay. Let me just say in conclusion, take another few minutes to say that basically the new round of Russian messianism based on traditional themes is potentially explosive, I would argue. We have seen that Russians have been prepared to go to wars and make enormous human sacrifices for causes they perceived as messianic. The multiple examples, including the disastrous Crimean adventure in the 19th century, the Crimean War, began. I mean, obviously, it's much more complicated than that, but basically, it began over an argument over two churches, and claimed at least 500,000 lives, at least on the Russian side. And I would argue the policymakers today should not take these matters lightly as something that supposedly belongs to the past. And just one example I want to sort of bring in to just to illustrate what I mean by the fact that people shouldn't be taking it lightly. The Russian diaspora, Russians, and we're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russians who live in Israel. Some of them Jewish, some of them not Jewish, halachically not Jewish, or I think even ethnically not Jewish. It's a big issue. I'm not going to go into this, but basically what I want to say is that in the eyes of the Russian state, driven by its messianic goals, the Russian diaspora in Israel is theirs. These people are their people, and there's no point arguing about this, whether or not this is true. This is how they see it. A person could say, you know, he severed his ties with Russia. He's left it 20 years ago. It doesn't matter. If a person, in the eyes of those who are determining ideology or for whom these matters are important, if these people are, in their eyes, are Russian, by whatever definition, this is how they will be seen in Russia. Obviously, you know, there's a new book just came out literally these days by Vladimir Bazeyev-Khanin called "From Russia to Israel and Back?" ? Contemporary traditional Russian Israeli diaspora. I haven't read it yet. No one has read it yet, but it may shed some light on this issue. But he may be dealing with the question how hundreds of thousands of Russians living in Israel and elsewhere are perceived from Moscow. What I'm saying is that it's a potentially explosive situation. People, when in the Knesset and in press elsewhere, you know, when people debate Chok HaShvut, people debate the right of return, all kinds of issues like that. This issue, I think, should be addressed. It should be, at the very least, it should be understood and taken into account. Thank you very much, and I will take questions, of course.
I only want to say that I absolutely assert this idea of Professor Geifman about that this is an explosive situation, because I monitor the Russian press in Israel, and every day I see I think, dangerous situations when the Russian repatriants, I don't know whether they're Russian or Jews, speak about the Ryan Jews here, Mizrahim, and especially about the religious Jews as a very bad human material, and express their belief that they will guide, that it will be the avant-garde of the Jewish people in Israel, in spite of, I don't see any explanation to it. I think that this presentation partly explains this strange thing, and we have to pay attention to it. It's really dangerous for us, I think.
Well, thank you, Elena. Yes, this Russian-Jewish conundrum is extremely interesting, and at the same time, it's extremely explosive, and it doesn't go anywhere. Well, and yeah, but this is our fate.
That's a very Russian statement.
And for for those who live in the Middle East for a lot of time, they're getting more used to this idea of destiny. It's, that's correct.